In our previous video, we walked you through a typical single server installation. In this two-part video, we're going to walk through a load-balanced installation with a separate active-passive queue. This design is used by some of our largest customers where high availability and fault tolerance are mandatory. We're going to assume that there is a high availability SQL resource already in the environment that is available to us. So we'll begin with the active-passive Faxination queue. The latest version of our Advanced Architecture Guide provides a step-by-step walkthrough for a load-balanced Faxination installation with an active-passive queue. This could easily be an 8-hour course all to itself. So we're going to concentrate on the order of operations and the elements that are specific to Faxination. Here you can see that we're in the Windows Server Failover Cluster Manager, and we're at the point where we need to choose a role for the cluster. We're going to select the File Server role, and then File Server for general use. Here we provide the name that the clients will use when they access the Q cluster group. Here we're going to call it Q cluster, but you can use whatever name fits your network naming structure. Since the Q cluster becomes a network entity distinct from the two nodes, we need to provide a static IP address for it. And after a confirmation and summary screen, we've created our cluster and we can test failover from one node to another. When we're satisfied that everything is working as expected, we make sure that the owner node is node 1, and that's where we'll begin the installation of the Faxination queue service. The Faxination queue service does not interact with SQL, but we will be installing the Faxination tools, including the address manager, which requires a SQL connection. The SQL NCLI MSI includes the entire installer for the SQL Server native client. Microsoft.NET 3.5 SP1 is not included in a standard Windows Server installation. The .NET FX 3.5 SP1 setup.exe file is a stub that initiates a download from Microsoft. If you have the full installer available on your network already, you should probably use that instead. Log on to QNode 1 using the service account that you've created for Faxination. Run setup.exe from the downloaded Faxination 2016 installation package. If this is the first time Faxination has been installed in your organization, or if you're upgrading from Faxination 2010 or older, you'll probably want to extend the Active Directory schema. This is not a requirement for Faxination, but most of our customers find Active Directory integration to be very convenient, and it allows for day-to-day Faxination user administration through Active Directory users and computers. After the schema has been extended, it takes less than a minute, or if you don't need to extend the schema, click on the Fenestrae Faxination Server 2016 button to begin the installation. Immediately, the Faxination installer is going to look for a local installation of SQL. We've only installed the SQL Server native client, which gives us the ODBC and OLEDB libraries for native SQL communication. The installer will offer to install a local version of SQL Express. For the purposes of our training scenario, we're assuming that there is already a high availability SQL resource in our environment, and we'll select No. You are prompted to save the end user license agreement to the hard drive. We're going to save it, accept the terms, and click Next. We're going to uncheck Activate Product during installation. We're not installing the Faxination kernel on these QNode servers, so we don't need to go through the server activation just yet. Choose the Advanced installation. This will allow us to install only the components that we need for the Faxination queue service. Here we're going to keep the default selection of local kernel. It's a little counterintuitive until you realize that the standalone components option always requires an existing Faxination kernel. We're going to choose the local kernel now, but we'll refine this selection later in the install. Click Next. On the server components screen, keep the default selection of the tools. This will install the Fenestrae Server Administrator. Click Next. Click Clear All on the host and device component screens. We will only have the Q component running on these servers, and click Next. We're logged in using an account called Faxination SA, which is our Faxination service account. Here we need to provide the password for the service account so that we can create the Windows services. Click Next. This is the folder for the ActiveX controls. These files should be installed locally and not on the cluster. If you have special installation requirements, it's okay to change this to another local folder. Otherwise, click Next. Enable network load balancing, enable central storage, and disable Faxination server, and then click Next. Is this the first instance of the Faxination queue for this clustered configuration? Click Yes. Set the kernel data directory to be in the Fenestrae kernel folder on the shared cluster storage drive, in our case, E drive. You'll recall that this is the shared storage that we configured when we defined the cluster. That means that both nodes will have access to this information. Enter the name of your SQL resource and the credentials that will be used. The default is to use the kernel service account, but you can specify a different account if you need to. This information will be referenced during the main Faxination installation, so the SQL resource that you define here will be used for the entire fax server. The default SQL database name for Faxination is Messaging. It's arbitrary. It can be any name that you want. It should be unique and not a database created and used by an earlier version of Faxination. When in doubt, you can just append the current date to the end of the database name. That's what we often do in our test environments. Review the setup information. Confirm that the 4 paths in this list point to the shared cluster storage drive, which is E in our case, and the name and location of the SQL database. Click Next. This is a generic dialog. You may safely ignore this information for this install and click OK. Choose to start the Fenestrae Server Administrator and click Finish. We can see that the Fenestrae Server Administrator is running on Node 1, which is Q Node 1, and that there is a single service called Faxination Q Service. The service is stopped. Do not start it at this time. Launch the Failover Cluster Manager again. We can see that the Q cluster is running and the owner node is Q Node 1. Right-click on the Q cluster and move it from Q Node 1 to Q Node 2. Confirm that the Q cluster is running on the second cluster node, then connect to the second node to continue the installation. Now we're on Q Node 2, and we're going to repeat the same process again with the following changes. Enable network load balancing, enable central storage, and disable Faxination server. Click Next. Is this the first instance of the Faxination queue for this clustered configuration? This time, we click No. Here we specify the name of the node that we've already completed, Q Node 1. The installer will look at Q Node 1 and copy its configuration. And we receive the same summary and confirmation screens that we did on the first node. Click Next and complete the installation. Within the Fenestrae Server Administrator on Node 2, Q Node 2, we can see that there is a single service called Faxination Q Service. The service is stopped, and we're still not quite ready to start it yet. Now we'll run the Fenestrae Cluster Wizard. This tool creates the cluster resources for us automatically. The utility is in the C drive program files Fenestrae Tools cluster folder. Click Add. Accept the default profile and click Add. The cluster name is auto-detected. Click Next. Select the cluster group resource from the drop-down and click Next. You will get a summary of the Cluster Wizard actions. Click Finish to apply those actions. The cluster has now been configured. You can bring the cluster resource group online now or choose later. We're going to choose later so we can show you the view from the Failover Cluster Manager. In the Failover Cluster Manager, right-click on the Q cluster and select Start Role. We now have the Faxination Q service running on Node 2, which is Q Node 2. Test that you can move the resource back and forth between the two nodes, test failovers, etc. And that completes the installation of the active-passive Faxination Q cluster.